Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy, one stop destination for English medium civil services aspirants. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we pick up today's the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper and we analyze the important articles which have appeared in today's paper in a comprehensive manner, taking up the topics relevant both for your mains as well as for your prelims examination. And at the end of the discussion, we shall be analyzing the art of answer writing as well, with the help of two practice subjective type questions, which I urge all of you to do write it on your own, practice it, and thereby get it evaluated. Now, before we come to the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today, a couple of announcements. First, regarding the Civil Services Championship test, which is going to be conducted on 10th of March from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Do appear for this scholarship test, and if you perform well, you can very well earn various different types of prizes and get a significant amount of discount as well. Now, regarding the free classes, the special classes which are going to be conducted today, so at 7 a.m. you had the NCRT fundamental series by Abhishek sir, and at 9 p.m. you will have a discussion of Indian society and diversity decoding and PYQ analysis by Astha ma'am. Now, having said that, let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today. So, today in total, we are going to discuss around 14 topics from very diverse areas, from areas associated with GS paper 1, GS paper 2, 3, and also for the prelims perspective. But today's newspaper on the event of Women's Day has largely concentrated the articles around the conditions of women, the labor force participation, and what needs to be done to improve the socio-economic well-being of women at large. So let us take a look at the 8 topics that we are going to discuss in significant detail. Kerala comes up with long and short-term measures to prevent man-animal conflict. That has appeared in page 8, relevant for your GS paper 3. This is a kind of an ongoing story piece which has been basically following the various different types of animal conflict, man animal conflict in the state of Kerala, particularly around the region of Wayanad. And the judiciary has also pulled up the government. As a result of that, the government has come up with both long as well as the short term measures. We shall be analyzing what they are. Then, a slippery slope. This is a follow up of yesterday's story about the Supreme Court pulling up the forest official and a very prominent ex politician of Uttarakhand regarding the deforestation which has happened in the Corbett Tiger Reserve. So, this has appeared in the editorial section, relevant again for your GS paper 3. Then, troubled waters. This has also appeared in the editorial page. This is about the ongoing and the ensuing conflict between China and Philippines and US wading into those murky and troubled waters. So that is relevant for your GS paper 2. Then after that, you have a list of articles and a host of articles talking about women's labor force participation and their well-being, a bold step towards cervical cancer free future. What is the 90-70-90 strategy that WHO has formulated? That is something that we are going to discuss again in the editorial section. This can be relevant for your GS paper 1 as well as for the GS paper 3. Then the determinant in more women in the job market. How is it that women labor force participation is low? Why is it so? And the patriarchal angle associated with it, relevant with GS paper 1 and also your essay paper. In fact, you had an essay question asked from the exact same topic in UPSC earlier as well. Fall and rise in women's workforce participation, the burden of women in the construction sector, which has got a huge and a tremendous scope for employing people. Bridging the gender gap in health research, why that is required. So, that again is relevant for both your GS paper 1 and GS paper 3. Overall, all these articles, you can think about it and understand and analyze it together, and you can formulate a very good essay regarding women empowerment, one of the favorite areas of UPSC. Then we are going to discuss 6 topics which have appeared in paper which can be relevant for your prelims examination. So center to rope in ISRO to provide internet in remote villages, the tribal habitations in various different states by setting up of VSATs. Center estimates dip in onion potato production, but the production of other horticultural crops they are set to increase. INS Kolkata assists vessels in Gulf of Aden, the troubled waters in the region or around the Arabian Peninsula. Yesterday marked a different turn when INS Kolkata, a naval destroyer ship, came to the rescue of two vessels and thereby rescuing 21 people overall. After 3 years, steel demand to grow in single digits. Why is it that the steel demand is reducing? Cabinet approves artificial intelligence corpus. It has approved close to around 10,300 crore fund as a corpus to promote AI based startups and functionality of the AI sector. Then government panel backs higher carbon tax in imported coal. Now, this is in line with the policies adopted by various different countries of the world in order to meet their carbon targets and the emission targets thereby. So, in total, these 14 topics are going to be discussed today in detail. Starting with the first topic, and this is the topic that talks about the man animal conflict, which has been happening in various parts of the country, particularly in the state of Kerala. That has been quite apparent because of the people getting killed and eventually the angst and the anger which is building up in the habitations and the settlements against the wildlife. Now that is taking a quite a dangerous turn, to put it very mildly. Now here, one has to understand that when it comes to biodiversity or any of the animals in particular, the loss of biodiversity is one of the major threats that was identified way back in 1972 in the Stockholm Conference. The Stockholm Conference, which is considered to be the mother of all conventions and conferences regarding environment and environmental protection, basically identified three threats which could endanger the human population and the planet that we see, the planet that we live in. Amongst those three threats, which were identified way back in 1972, one was climate change, another was pollution, and the third was the loss of biodiversity. Now, when we say loss of biodiversity, why is it that we face the loss of biodiversity? Now, the common preconceived notion that our minds have is the fact that biodiversity is lost by hunting and poaching only. That is it. But that is not the case, right? So, when we factor in the loss of biodiversity and the causes for that, for loss, one of the major causes is actually the fragmentation of habitat. Fragmentation of habitat. That is, their natural spaces are being encroached upon by human habitations, developmental parameters, etc., reducing the area from where they can forage food, reducing the area from where they get the supply of drinking water, and so on. So, this is one of the major threats. Then, other than that, this also automatically, as a kind of a follow up, leads to the inevitability of the man animal conflict. That is what the article is about, man animal conflict. Now, this man animal conflict basically arises. Why? Because if you have developed settlements and habitations around the forested areas, and in many of the cases inside the forested areas, the animals, they will follow their own natural route which they have been following for generations. Particularly in the case of elephants, elephants are known to follow a particular route to get water, to get food, and they pass on this knowledge from one generation to another generation. That is why even in the researches which have been carried out in the region of southern part of India, it has been indicated and it has come to light that every year There is migration and movement of elephants from the region of the west to the region of east and vice versa in the lower part of the peninsular India in order to gain access to water, particularly during the dry season. Now, in their route and in their pathway, if you have habitations, what will happen? Naturally, the animals will venture into the farmlands. When they venture into the farmlands, they will be destroying the crops also. They will be consuming the fruits, etc., and the foraging the trees nearby. That angers the people naturally, and the people stand up in arms against the animals. And that is where you have a kind of a topsy turvy situation or a race to the bottom that who gets eliminated. Eventually, it is always going to be the case that the animals are going to be eliminated. Then, another factor. Another factor is invasive alien species. Now, these invasive alien species are basically those kind of plants or animals which are naturally not of that particular area, which have been brought into that particular area. They have started to thrive in that area, and now they have replaced the indigenous and the natural varieties of vegetation and animals which are typically found. Now, in this particular case and in this particular article, this invasive alien species has also got a substantial role to play in accelerating and exaggerating this man-animal conflict. How? So here, particularly in the state of Kerala, you have one of those invasive alien species of plant, which is known as the Senna spectabilis. Senna spectabilis. Now, this is a plant species which grows very fast, very quickly. And you would have seen it in your natural environment also. You will have smaller, shorter trees with thin stems who have got that beautiful yellowish flowers all around them. Now, they were initially brought in for decorative purposes, but their ability to grow so very quickly and the ability to reproduce and propagate, that has increased their population and increased the population at an unsustainable levels. Now, what this species of plant, or the alien species of plant rather, what it has done is it has replaced the natural vegetation and the natural green cover of an area. Why? And it is basically because of the kind of interaction that the species have. If you think about it, why it replaces the natural vegetation, think about it. Here you have a tree which grows very, very quickly. The growing time is very short. Now, naturally, the availability of sunlight and resources in the surrounding area, that will be drained away. Sunlight won't be available. So the other plants, they might have a very stymied growth, and eventually they might stop growing in that area itself. So here, the Senna spectabilis plant, that is absolutely unaffected, but the surrounding plants, they are basically getting destroyed. This kind of population interaction amongst the species in an area where one species does not feel any difference or any damage, but the other species, they face that disaster, that is what is referred to as amensalism. That is relevant for your prelims, where species of the plant, in this case, is not impacted at all by its surroundings. But the other species of plants, the native plants, they are getting damaged, their growth is getting stymied because of that invasive alien species. That population interaction is immense. Now, because of this Senna spectabilis, the availability of the natural green vegetation which the elephants would consume, that has reduced quite tremendously. And regardless of whatever misconceptions that we have, that when it comes to herbivores, they will basically stomp on and chew on any of the green vegetation which is available, that is not the case. Many of the plants and many of the leaves, they find it absolutely unpalatable. And that is where they basically are in the dearth of availability of food. And for that, for gaining that food, for acquiring that food, they venture into the regions of habitations. And that is when the conflict arises. Now, what are the long term and the short term measures which are proposed? So, if you take a look at the long term measure, for example, one is the case of smart fencing, installation of smart fences. Smart fences, basically, now the definition of smart fences in itself is quite varied. When you talk about the installation of smart fences across the border areas, let's suppose the defense ministry tomorrow comes out with a statement that we are installing smart fences in the Indo-Pak border. Now, that is a very different kind of a smart fence. It will have laser detection points as well, so as to stop intrusion, alarm systems, etc. But here, when we are concerned with the wildlife, in the case of the wildlife, these smart fences are installed around the habitations, the settlements, and the farmlands. And these fences have very low amount of charge which passes through them. Now that automatically brings down the incursion of these wild animals, these elephants, because regardless of anything, they are wary of that electrical shock, regardless of howsoever minor it might be. They refrain from going into those areas. So that is the purpose that the smart fences would solve. Then, other than that, tackling the invasive alien species, tackling invasive species. And in invasive species, you have a variety of invasive species in this region which have destroyed the local ecosystem and destroyed the local vegetation cover. One of them is Senna spectabilis, for which the Kerala government and the forest department last year had launched the project Vanikaran, whereby there was a promotion of indigenous and native varieties of plants and basically populate those areas of natural vegetation with the native varieties, reducing the scope for the Senna variety of plant to replace it. So that is why Project Vanikaran was already launched. But other than that, plant species such as eucalyptus, they have also been termed as a kind of a threat. Eucalyptus is not native to India. Eucalyptus is a plant which grows super fast. It exploits all the water from the surrounding regions, rendering the nearby area dry for any other kind of plant species. So that is another factor. Then, other than that, drone surveillance, usage of drones. Now, these drones and the surveillance of drones can easily monitor the movement of the wild animals, identify the pathways that they take, and thereby provide a kind of a curative measure. And wherever required, wildlife corridors can then be facilitated for the easy movement of these animals from one region to another. Now, removal of undergrowth in the private estates, the commercial farmings where you have the coffee and the tea cultivation. So that undergrowth will be removed so that the animals don't come foraging for that and looking for that. And it is that undergrowth which attracts. Undergrowth basically means lot of plant and small shrubs in the lower reaches and basically not having a great height, but they serve as food. Now, it is this undergrowth because of which they enter the agricultural farmland. Then eradication we have talked about, and basically formation of a monitoring committee to look into the concerns of the people as well and to ensure that this conflict does not enrage and turn into something which is disastrous in the long run. Okay. So that is what this article is about. And this is a submission made by the Kerala government and the forest department. And this article we have discussed why that man animal conflict is happening, the threat to biodiversity. It is amongst the triple threats that was identified in the Stockholm conference, the impact of invasive alien species, and what are the measures in order to get rid of this issue and to find an amicable solution. So that is what this article is largely about. Moving to the second article, which has appeared in the editorial section. This is also associated with the discussion that we had yesterday about the deforestation happening in the region of the Corbett Tiger Reserve, where the Supreme Court and the judges they came down very heavily on an ex-DFO, the forest official, and along with that, a very prominent ex-politician or ex-minister rather, the connivance of whom and the nexus between them led to the deforestation and cutting down of close to around 6,000 trees in the region around the Corbett Tiger Reserve in order to facilitate tourism. And in the name of tourism, basically ecotourism, tiger safaris, right? Now, here this article talks about the fact that when we talk about tourism, when we talk about any kind of tourism in the wild areas or the forest areas, there are obviously benefits associated with that tourism. First of all, any kind of tourism will generate revenue, isn't it? You will have people coming to that area. So it is revenue generating. It is beneficial for the local population. It can basically generate jobs and businesses in the locality, in the vicinity. You have various different resorts which are being set up. Even for that, Supreme Court issued the statement and issued a very stern warning that look, all these resorts they have become centers of different type of let's suppose people coming for celebrations, weddings, etc. And you have loud music blaring through the night, and that can have a detrimental impact on the wildlife zone as well. Right. So revenue will increase by job creation, more footfalls, and also you have the resort culture, which is so these are the benefits which are direct. The indirect benefit which is sought to be attained by promoting these tiger safaris and ecotourism is the fact that eventually when people go through these forested areas, when they look at wildlife in nature, it raises an awareness. And raising of awareness is of prime importance and prime relevance when it comes to the entire aspect of conservation. UNESCO, in its very ambitious Man and Biosphere program, which was launched way back in 1971, talked about the fact that unless and until you raise the awareness and you make the people aware that, okay, these animals that we see in the pictures, in the various different articles, these animals themselves are a force of nature to be reckoned with and to be appreciated of. That is when the act of conservation happens. So awareness creation is also a major advantage, right? So these are the advantages why ecotourism is being promoted. But there has been a paradigm shift in the past few years observed across the globe, not only in India, but across the globe. And India is also following the same line, where these ecotourism avenues, such as the safaris, they are being sought as job creators in the state economy, in the local economy. They are being seen as the prime drivers of job creation. That is where the problem begins. Because when you purely look at it as a factor, empirical evidence of a job creation, you will look at numbers. So if I have had two tiger safari centers, which have created, let's suppose, 200 jobs, as an administrator, I will always start thinking on the lines that let's get four of these centers, let's get 10 of these centers, let's get 20 of them, more jobs will be created. So that is where the compounding happens. And it is absolutely disproportionate to the requirement and the ability of the nature to handle it. That is where there has been a significant conflict, in the sense that various different governments have been promoting these safaris relentlessly, but at the same time there is that threat. Now in India, you have the NTCA, National Tiger Conservation Authority, which is a statutory body. This is again a relevant snippet for your prelims. The National Tiger Conservation Authority, that is the NTCA, is a statutory organization along with the Central Zoo Authority. These are the bodies who are responsible for framing of rules, regulations about how to move around the wildlife region, the zones, particularly the tiger reserves, how to monitor these animals, etc. Now, as per the mandate and as per the directives of these bodies, it comes out to the fact that the safaris are okay to run because of the benefits as long as it is not encroaching in the core area. And here, when they were issuing the directive, in the statement of purpose, they also stated something very objectively correct. And that was that look, you have the core zone, which has to be absolutely undisturbed, and you have the buffer zone as well. So let's suppose you have established a tiger safari center here. You are basically making people go around and move around the forested area here. So that will divert the attention away from the core zone. People won't be tempted to enter into the core zone, right? So that is a kind of a benefit. But here, the problem which exists is the fact that slowly and steadily, when you start taking a look at numbers, you will find that the safari centers are getting established much, much closer to the core zone. And that is when the direct intervention and the entire resort aspect of it also comes into light. That can generate profit, that can generate revenue. But where is it going to end? Today, you might have one tiger safari center here. Tomorrow, you might establish three of them here. In order to gain competitive advantage, let's suppose one state comes up with the fact that I have developed a wildlife resort directly in the core zone. You will get sightings of elephants, tigers as a guarantee. People will flock to that area. More people, more different state governments, more different authorities will do the same. So that is why it is a slippery slope that the authorities, the forest department has to tackle and has to take care of it. Okay, so this is basically the aspect which is represented in this article, and this is where the Supreme Court has basically asked the central government to monitor the entire paradigm and the norms of allowing these safari centers to operate. Under which regulation should they operate? Should they follow a kind of a guideline, reframe and relook the guidelines? Because when you frame the guidelines, eventually it does come out to be the case that the private players, under the connivance and the nexus of the officials and the politicians, they will find a loophole and they will establish centers where they should not. And that is why the guidelines need to be relooked at. Okay. Now, then we come to the third article of the day. And this article is about the Chinese and the Filipino conflict. Now, basically, you had a situation a couple of days back where a Chinese naval vessel and a Philippine supply vessel, both of them, they went for a collision, a deliberate collision. It is not as if both of them were looking somewhere else and just like the vehicles on the road, they actually collided. No. In the waters, in the high sea, collision is a kind of an aggression. If you have your vessels deliberately colliding with the other, understand that the impact can be from fires which can erupt to even the other vessel getting damaged so much that it can eventually sink down. Now, this is all happening in the troubled waters of South China Sea. South China Sea is a mineral rich area. In South China Sea, you find various different energy minerals, energy resources. Now, this is an area which is very rich in corals also, coral reefs. Particularly, this is happening around the Scarborough Shoal, which is very rich in terms of the corals. Now, rich in corals, who wants to have corals? But understand, wherever you have a significantly dominant coral population, there will be huge amount of fish population in that area also. So the scope for fisheries sector naturally increases, thereby increasing your revenue and income from the primary sector of the economy. So that is why these waters, That is something which all the countries in the region they want. But other than that, they will have hydrates of methane. They do have that. Hydrates of methane, which is basically a whitish solid structure that you find at the bottom of the seabed. And these are the methane particles which have solidified. So they appear very whitish. They are extracted as minerals. And China is using them to generate energy also. Various different countries want to do that, but it is the Chinese who have taken a leap in that area. So they are interested in these methane hydrates as well. Other than that, you will also find the presence or the regions rich in crude oil. There is an estimate that you have significant amount of crude oil and natural gas deposits to be found in this. Now, if all these minerals are present, automatically that will become a zone of conflict, a bone of contention. Now, the Philippines has got islands in the vicinity, various different islands in the vicinity, and that is the nature and the geography of that area. So, from one area to another, they oftentimes have the supply boats running from one region to another. It is in this supply and restocking missions that they encounter a conflict with the Chinese Navy. The Chinese naval forces, they are expanding their areas of dominance and claiming them as their own. Previously, also, this has happened many of the times, where both these navies have actually witnessed the collision, and the Chinese, in this particular case, they even deployed water cannons as an aggressive posture. You had the case where the Philippines and the Filipino Navy, in a previous scenario, they removed a floating barrier of 300 meters on sea, which was put by the Chinese around the Scarborough Shoal. Now, this conflict has basically put US in the entire scenario. And that is where the Chinese officials yesterday issued a statement asking US not to fish in these troubled waters, that this is a conflict between China and Philippines. We will sort it on our own. US should not enter, otherwise this conflict will escalate. But then the problem in this case is that whichever country China has got a conflict with, particularly in the South China Sea, all these countries are very, very small and pretty insignificant powers when it comes to the naval forces. So that is why the Chinese they basically bully them and they ram through in order to make their own agenda agreeable. And that is the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy that you would have heard about and read about. Now, in the present context as well, you have to understand that, as I told you, this is not a new conflict, but the government in Philippines has changed. Earlier, you had a mercurial president in the form of Duterte. Now, he was an individual who always downplayed the conflict. He wanted to be on very good terms with the Chinese. And that is where he agreed upon some of the policies of Chinese on the economic front, and even for that matter, for the vaccination. All the Chinese vaccines were imported at a heavy price with very low efficacy rates. So, the new prime minister, that is Marco Jr. in Philippines, he basically has deviated from that policy directive. He wants to make Philippines a strategic power and self-reliant power in that area. For that, Philippines is acquiring various different defense equipments. Even India, for that matter, has basically there is the pipeline to supply BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. So India is also collaborating with these countries. But then building up your strategic defense forces, it is not a 1 year job or a 6 month job that in 6 months my defense forces will be very powerful. It is a 10 year, 15-year vision that you are following. But in the meanwhile, what will you do for these intervening 15 years? Will you allow the Chinese to come on and carry out the incursion? Absolutely no. That is why Marco Jr. has taken the help of the US and frequently that does take the help of US. The US, on its part, ever since the Second World War, has always had some amount of token military presence in the region around Philippines. And that follows the Second World War legacy. Even today, the US, if you will look at it, has got access to all the military bases around Philippines. So that means the US Navy can enter into this conflict at the time of its choosing. And that puts the Chinese on a very difficult wicket. They cannot simply keep on bullying the region of Philippines. And that is why the anger issued by the officials of the Chinese government. Okay. Now, here, what is the way forward? What is the long run solution? The long run solution is actually going through a dialogue and finding an amicable solution acceptable to all parties. Mind you, Philippines had previously gone to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And as per the ruling of that Permanent Court of Arbitration, this Scarborough Shoal was allocated and allotted to Philippines. Its rights were cemented over this shoal. But then Chinese being Chinese, they simply said, we don't agree with this ruling. And we will continue doing what we do because we believe that what we do is right. And that puts the entire thing very far away from resolution. It is either my way or the highway. So that is why Philippines as of now requires the help of the various different powers in the Indo-Pacific region. And that is where the other countries can help in bolstering the defense of the Philippines and its naval forces so that this expansionism phase of China, which it is going through, that can be curtailed. Okay. Now, after that, coming to the article about the bold step towards cervical cancer free future. Now, this article talks about the fact. Now, this has appeared again in the editorial section. Now, this is relevant for your GS paper 1 also and GS paper 3 also. Now, cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is an ailment which impacts women quite significantly. It is the second most common case of cancer which impacts women in India. You have more than 1.27 lakh cases of the cervical cancer being reported. Now, this article talks about the fact that the government in the budget had initiated various programs in order to get rid of this malaise. And that is worth appreciating and that is worth taking a note of. But before that, what is this cervical cancer? So, cervical cancer, which occurs basically in the cervix, it develops in the woman's cervix and it happens because of infection from the high risk human papilloma virus, generally due to the sexual contact. So, this HPV is basically the cause of that cervical cancer and it can be quite debilitating. It can impact quite significantly. So, what is the cure for this? First of all, if timely intervention is made, much of that burden of the disease is already taken care of. But vaccination is something which also needs to be done. So, for this, in order to get rid of this problem, WHO has come up with what is known as the 90-70-90 strategy. What is that? When we say 90-70-90, means 90% of women to be fully vaccinated by the age 15. So that automatically reduces the chances of them contacting any of this disease. Then 70% of the women to be screened for this human papilloma virus by the ages 35 and 45. Because when this cancer develops and goes into the mature stage, in most of the cases, it leads to the loss of life. Timely screening can provide the cure in these areas. And then 90% of the women to be treated for this virus. So WHO basically argues that with the combination of all of these, you can have a significantly successful situation where the spread of this cervical cancer can be stymied, can be cut off from the grassroots. Now, when it comes to vaccination, here 90% and the first stage is to provide the vaccine. Now, vaccinations have yielded very positive results across the world. And there have been cases highlighted for Scotland where when young girls were administered this vaccine, there was no reported case for this cervical cancer for people being born in the era between late 80s to the early 90s because they were vaccinated. And that is why new cases were not reported and new cases basically did not happen. Australia also experimented with this, and Australia also achieved remarkable success against the cervical cancer. In our own vicinity, various different countries from Sri Lanka to Bhutan to Indonesia, all of them have instituted vaccines for stopping this kind of disease. Now, here, Bhutan, as always, is a kind of a success story. Bhutan is one of those low middle income countries. You cannot argue that Bhutan has got so much amount of money, such good amount of healthcare and condition of healthcare that it can do anything and everything it wants. It has got very poor state of the economic setup, to say it in a mild manner. Bhutan was successful in having a very significantly universal coverage of the vaccine, and it started administering the vaccine to adolescent boys as well, so that the boys also don't develop, the male members also don't develop this virus. Eventually, this virus spreads as a result of that sexual contact. So, if you prevent the occurrence of virus in both the sexes, that is when the idea is that you can eventually stop the mass spread of this disease. Now, in India also, there is a success story. And in India, when we talk about the success story, that is by the state Sikkim. Now, Sikkim again, you have to give it to the fact that not significantly developed infrastructure, connectivity is always an issue. But even in these scenarios, Sikkim, when it administered the vaccine, the spread of it was close to around 97%. That is, 97% of the people eligible or who should be administered the vaccines, 97% of them were given the vaccine. Now, in India, we deal with, and all the developing countries, you deal with an issue that is known as vaccine hesitancy. If you have seen that there is a vaccine for a particular disease, you are reluctant to take that because you are always pessimistic and skeptical about the side effects that the vaccine can have. That is where Sikkim basically worked on the awareness campaign, and mass awareness campaign was carried out. So, education and awareness about this particular disease, education and awareness. Okay, this was significantly helpful in promoting the vaccination and in a way nudging the people, nudging the girls to come out and take the vaccine. Now, India has recently developed its own vaccine. The Serum Institute of India, with the collaboration of Department of Biotechnology, they have developed the vaccine that is Servavax. This has been developed by the Serum Institute of India, the one which came out with the Covishield, the Serum Institute of India, and Department of Biotech. Now, they have developed this vaccine, which is very, very cheap as compared to the international standards. Very cheap. So, these kind of vaccines should be deployed en masse in large numbers. And then also, the government, just on the lines of the CoWIN platform, remember during the COVID days, you had the CoWIN platform whereby it could be tracked that how many vaccines you have taken and what is the coverage of the vaccine delivery in various different paths. That could be monitored from the central team. Now, here, the government has come up with the plan is to have a UWIN platform, which talks about the universal vaccinations for various different diseases which are administered across the country. So that platform development, that is UWIN on the lines of COVID, right? This is to track and monitor. Okay. Eventually, you also have to vaccinate the male members. That is how you can or rather, that is how you can curb the spreading of this particular disease. Because this disease not only impacts the health of the woman in many of the parts of the country, they are afraid to even report it due to the stigma associated. And eventually, it leads to the early demise of the women member. That has got a socio-economic impact on the family structure in that area, in that vicinity. And that is why cervical cancer needs to be taken up on priority. And that is why you will have, or that is when we will achieve a kind of an era, a realm where cervical cancer is a thing of the past. Because we have already done that. In the case of the COVID vaccination, we had an immense amount of public participation in that vaccination. In the case of polio vaccination, we have eradicated polio for all the good measures, right? From our country. Why? Because of the awareness. And remember the very famous lines of the polio, our vicinity region of Bhutan. Why did they succeed? And eventually the case of Sikkim and the way forward, the impact of it on the socio-economic and the family issue. Okay, now then we come to the next article, and that is the determinant in more women in the job market. Now, again, in the editorial section. Now, this is partly to do with the GS paper 1 and partly to do with the economy portion in GS paper 3. Because when you would have been studying the reports brought out by the IMF, the World Bank, various different economic parameters, all of them, they argue the same agenda, and which is right also. And that is that labor force participation in India is abysmal when it comes to women. Women do not have that great a labor force participation. In fact, compared to our surrounding countries, it is amongst the lowest. Now, the argument is that if you have more women participating in the labor force, automatically, not only will the GDP increase, IMF reports, they indicate that it can add value to the GDP by almost 3 points, right? If you have a greater female labor force participation, if the female labor force participation in India crosses the threshold of 50%, your GDP can improve by 3 points. So all of them have argued that. But still, we are not seeing the results on the ground in terms of increased female labor force participation. So this article says that look, it is not as if you have women and who are simply sitting idle and they don't want to work. It is the case of double burden. And that double burden comes with the inherent patriarchal setup which has developed in the society, which has been inherited in the society. Patriarchal setup is basically where you have male dominance in the family or the society and in terms of decision. As per that patriarchal setup and as per the normal preconceived notion, men are supposed to do the earning, women are supposed to do the household chores and basically take care of the family as well. Now, this is where the double burden aspect comes into. That is, even if you expect the woman to work, you will observe that they have to take care of the family also, the household also, and work simultaneously. How can that happen? So, as a result of that, many women, they either drop out of the labor market altogether, or in many of the cases, they choose to work very close to their homes. They choose to work in such a scenario where the work life is very, very light. They choose such profiles where they don't have to put in such effort. so that they can concentrate on the household chores. It is not as if the household chores are looked down upon. Taking care of the family is something bad. But then there is equal work and the equal burden that men also have to share. Now, this article also argues, and argues successfully for that matter, that why is it that household chores are considered to be a low end and a menial job? Because at the end of it, any work, any job that you go for, you would expect appraisals, increments, salary hikes, recognition, and you moving up the ladder. But when it comes to household work, there is no recognition. It is considered to be a part of your inherent duty. There is no significant upward mobility, no economic incentive, and eventually it is a kind of a dead end. So that is a kind of a job which can be considered to be menial and without much output. So that is why when we talk about women labor force participation, that can happen only if you get rid of this problem of double burden. Otherwise, you won't have people working successfully, looking at their careers, or people only taking care of the household, right? So this is what the article argues. And here, the aspect of patriarchy is one of the reasons why that is the case. The other aspect is that women, they choose to or they prefer to choose the kind of work which is not very taxing, which is not very imposing, so that they can pay attention to the household chores. So they are riddled with a double burden. It is here that UPSC had asked a question, and that was that the woman and the woman empowerment is bogged down by the double burden that they face. And that is the double burden that UPSC had asked for. It was asked in the essay paper. It was followed next year by again another question in the same essay paper, that modern woman in India is a myth. So this talks about the empowerment. Now, here you also have to understand that either you develop a parameter in the GDP for measuring women's contribution in the household, or you basically devise a strategy where they can work and even the men get some burden or the some share of the responsibility of the household, and they can be flexible with their work timings as well. It is nowhere written that because you are born a male you have to do certain tasks and the women have to do another task. When it comes to, let's suppose, women basically going out to jobs, going out for work, that is where you have domestic help, and the domestic help, the maids, they don't get paid adequately. Now, there also, you will find the increased concentration and prevalence of women from weaker sections of the society. Now, they are oppressed there also, even though they are earning, but they are getting oppressed because of increased amount of work. When it comes to getting these house helps, for example, the International Labour Organization had a convention which talked about that these house helps should be given minimum wage, weekly off, increments, etc. India has not signed that convention altogether. And we all are aware how the household helps they are treated in the society at large. So this is another form of exploitation. We should not concentrate our thinking only at the women working in high-end jobs. Okay, so if you want to overall increase the participation, you have to end the exploitation. That is the aspect of this article. Okay, then we come to the fall and rise in women's work participation, the numbers, and this is about the data game. Basically, various different surveys have indicated, right? When we talk about the various surveys, let's suppose the periodic labor force survey, the national sample survey, all of these have indicated that there is a drastic fall when it comes to the female labor force participation in India. The labor force participation, which was close to around 42%, right? when you talk about 93 to 94, 93, 94, 94 to around 2004, 5, it was basically 42%. That plummeted to 28% in 2011-12. That further has plummeted to basically 22% in 2017-18. However, the recent survey has so observed the trend. It is decreasing. The recent survey has indicated that it has jumped back to 36% in 22-23. It has jumped back up. Now, there are people who doubt this data altogether, who say that this data is inaccurate, that doesn't represent the actual labor force participation. Actual labor force participation is much less. But then, that reducing labor force participation, if you remove the political angle of blame, argument, and counter argument being put forward, this labor force participation has been attributed to women moving out of the agricultural sector, where you had women having the maximum share of employment, self-employment in particular, as the family would be involved in agricultural sector, they would also carry out their jobs in the agricultural sector. So they have moved out of agricultural sector, and that is where the argument on the side of the government and the side of the policymakers is that look, there has been prosperity which has come in, and that prosperity means added level of income, and now the women, they are not participating in the menial jobs or the small income jobs in agricultural sector. Right? Slowly and steadily the education is improving, and they will be moving to the service sector and high end jobs. That is why you see a fall in labor force participation as of now. Now, this argument is basically backed by the theory given by Claudia Goldin, for which she was awarded the Nobel Prize last year. Basically, Claudia Goldin, when she studied the US labor force market, she observed the time period between 1790 and around 1970. And she observed that initially the labor force participation of women was close to around 60%. That marked a significant downfall. And then, after and in the 20th century, that significantly and exponentially increased. And this was attributed to a decline in the agricultural involvement, that the level of income would increase, so women would move into other areas and they would not carry out the job. And then eventually they would spend more time in studies, in skilling, and eventually, as a result of that, the labor force participation of women would decrease, it would bottom up. And then, when education was increased, expectation from women changed, that you are no longer simply a house help, you are no longer responsible only for the well-being of the family, you have to make a name for yourself. That is when they start taking up the higher level jobs and jobs at the higher strata. So that is why it is referred to as the U-shaped curve for women labor force participation. So the argument which has been put by the government and the organizations is the fact that here also, in India also, the decline that you are observing is because of the same aspect, that people are moving out of agriculture. They will eventually move into other sectors, and that will be reflected in the long run. But the data, that tells us something different. Data tells us that you have a simultaneous decline of the men labor force participation in agricultural sector as well, right? So that data is not being backed up. So here, if you take a look at this data, then women's work in family farms, for example, it was 23% in 1993, it reduced to 10% in 2017, right? So the work in family farms has reduced. Then it bounced back to 23% again in 5 years. So how is it possible? if they are moving out of agricultural sector, why is it that it will bounce back up? Now, this is where the sample collection, the survey collection, that has been put into question. Because in the National Sample Survey and the Periodic Labor Force Survey, which is conducted, the questions are framed and women are asked about their primary job and subsidiary secondary job, if any. Now, for a person and a woman in the rural household who basically carry out the job of, let's suppose, going to the farm also in the morning, then doing the household chores, then let's suppose reading some pickles to be sold in the market, for them, secondary, subsidiary jobs, etc., they don't make any sense at all. So that is why many of them, they do not end up reporting it. So that is one of the reasons why the data does not reflect in adequate numbers. And when the questions were framed properly, as it was done by the National Council of Economic Research, now there the data pointers were and the questions were framed properly and people were asked directly, then the numbers reflected a different reality altogether. Right? So it is about how you look at the numbers also. That is also a part of the game. But more importantly, one has to focus going ahead, moving forward. One has to definitely put attention into the kind of jobs that you are generating. Fair enough if the role of women in household agricultural sector that is reducing, but are we educating enough number of women to take up the jobs that they want, that they need in order to fulfill their own personal ambitions and desires, in order to make them successful professionals? That is where the role of the government should come in. That is what the article argues, that both the opposition and the government, rather than bickering over which data is correct, which data is not, what is the inference of the data, they should consistently be harping upon the fact that regardless of howsoever you look at the data from the previous years, all of them, they indicate a stagnation in terms of the kind of jobs that women labor force is participating in. That needs to change. Okay, and for that you need education, you need awareness and setting up of expectation parameters for the woman, and that can be done at the primary scale of education, at the primary school itself, where women should be encouraged to reach heights parallel to the men. Okay, that is what this article is about. Now the next article, that is about bridging the gender gap in health research. Now, what is the context of this article? This article basically talks about the fact that when it comes to medical research, development of vaccines, development of medicine, always the male gender is looked at. And even for the human trials, etc., the participation of men, that is done in a manner where it is understood that women's body will also react in the same way. That is where the problem lies. Because when it comes to the body's own response system, that varies from one region to another, from one gender to another. So that is where the gender aspect should be kept in mind while carrying out the medical research. So how do you do that? So basically, for that, various different measures have been propagated, have been advised in this article. One is to ensure participation and gender equity in clinical trials which are there for development of medicines and vaccines. Then other than that, you need to have gender specific markings and gender specific announcements and specifications for the various medicines, that this medicine is suitable for men, this medicine is not suitable for women, etc., etc. So gender specific declarations in medicines, more research on efficacy of medicines across genders, and more importantly, raising awareness. Aware. So these factors have been advocated that if they are brought in, only then in the even in the issue of health research, where we don't think about that there is a gender inequality, even in those areas, we can promote a kind of gender parity and we can bring about a overall well-being of the society. Okay. Now, then, so all these articles, they indicate what? They indicate a common parameter, that how we basically treat and see women in the society, that is so very biased and has got a male angle associated with it, that eventually and deliberately, or even not in a deliberate manner, puts them in the position of disadvantage. Then, after that, we move on to the last detailed article, and that is the burden of women in the construction sector. Now, construction sector, which is amongst the largest employment generating sectors in the country, that construction sector has got a significant women labor force participation. Workforce participation is there. But the problem with this is that oftentimes women, basically most of the women, they come from very weaker sections of the society, economically weaker, socially backward sections of the society as well. Most of the women working in the construction sector, they come from the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes of the society. So they face deprivations. And along with that, they get very menial amount of money. Now, in that construction sector, oftentimes, as per the survey which was conducted, it was found out that many of the women, they do multiple work simultaneously. They will take care of the household, they will take care of their babies or the young ones as well, simultaneously maybe carrying a bucket of bricks or a bag of cement from one region to another. Now, what that does is further exaggerate the health issues, reduce the life expectancy for both the woman and the child as well. So the entire family aspect gets deprived. Now, here one particular aspect has been focused upon, and that is that when we talk about the construction sector, it provides you job, but the income is very low, particularly for the women. Why? Because majority of the women that you find working in the construction sector, they are working at the level of the low end of the skill parameter, low skill jobs, lifting, carrying, etc. And the contractors and the supervisors, the smart fellows that they are, they will not have them working continuously for 8 hours or 10 hours so that they have to pay overtime, etc. They might end up working for 12 hours through the day, but it will be in chunks. 2 hours you have to carry the cement bag, then after that 3 hours you have to do this, 4 hours you have to do that. That is why they multitask. And while it comes to payment, they will give you some amount for carrying the cement bag, some amount for the other task. You don't get paid in bulk. That means low income. And because they don't have that skill, the low income perpetuity continues. So, what should be done? Provided that this sector is such a green shoot for providing employment, and as Indian economy is rapidly expanding, infrastructure and the construction sector, that is one of those sectors which are going to provide long-term solutions in the job market. So what should be done? Upskilling. Upskilling at various different levels need to be done. Skill the woman and provide that skill in order to handle even the complicated machineries, and they would be able to do so. There is no reason that just because you are a woman, you won't be able to handle these machineries out there. So that is why upskilling is required. And then cross sector deployment. They should not only be restricted to the menial job. That cross sector deployment is a must. Then you need to have the living wage paid to them, not the minimum wage, the living wage. living wage in which you can have a comfortable life. And then proper conditions of housing and shelter. In the labor colonies around the construction sector, if you venture, look at the conditions of shelter and housing. It is absolutely abysmal, very, very poor. So that is what needs to be done for this construction sector to absorb more women because it has got the scope. And mostly you have migrant population working in the construction forest and they are forced to work simultaneously in multiple areas. And what is the way forward that needs to be brought? Okay. Now, then we move on to the prelims based topics. So basically, which we'll cover briefly. So center to rope in ISRO to provide internet in 80 remote tribal villages, particularly in the states of Odisha, Maharashtra, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and so on. Right? So in these various areas, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, and Maharashtra, you have the ministry talking with ISRO to set up the internet services. So how do they provide the internet services? With the help of the VSAT station. What are VSAT stations? So this is, what is it? That is very small aperture terminal. So VSAT stations are basically your portable linkages which provide the access to internet. For areas which are in remote locations where you do not have availability of regular sources of communication, you can have these VSAT centers established which can catch the data from the satellites and which can provide very good and reliable internet linkage. Now, this internet linkage will uplift the social conditions of the people working in this area or living in this area by providing them access to healthcare, which is very important, providing them access to, let's suppose, education services in far off places, because we are living in the era where digital divide is a reality. If you do not have the access to internet or the data systems, you can get devoid or denied government services, provisions, welfare schemes, and more importantly, education system. That is why that VSAT system seeks to provide or bridge that digital divide or that digital gap. So that is the aspect that the ministry is working for. This is being run on a pilot basis in these particular states. Later on, it will be monitored and then successfully implemented in other areas. Simultaneously, the ministry has also had an agreement with AIMS Delhi in order to finalize and carry out the research work impacting the tribal population, that is the sickle cell anemia and the sickle cell disease, where the RBCs themselves, they get slightly deflated and get into the shape of the sickle cell, leading to a loss of nutrition in the cells of the body. Okay. Now, the second article, center estimates dip in onion potato production. So this has been an advanced estimate for the 2023-24 season, where the horticultural crops, they are estimated to increase. The production is estimated to increase to around 355.25 million tons. Quite significant. Horticultural crops are the ones which add value in terms of the farm income, be it the tomatoes, be it the fruits, etc. These are the ones which will yield you more amount of money rather than wheat and rice. So it is a very good sign that our horticultural production and the crop production has increased. It is estimated to go up to 355 million tons. But the problem here is that while the production of fruits have increased, particularly mango, pineapple, mandarin, these are the fruits whose production has increased. But simultaneously, you expect, and the ministry is expecting, a dip in the onion and the potato production. When we talk about the onion production, basically the last year the production was 302 lakh tons, and this year it is expected to fall to 254 tons. In the case of potato, last year it was around 601 lakh tons. It is expected to fall to around 590 tons. So there has been a fall. And this has largely been attributed to climate change and the vagaries of the climate. Because when we talk about onions, so onions, they are initially the seed is planted, then as the saplings grow, then it is transplanted, and eventually it is harvested. At any point of time, if they come across a very uh, unpredictable weather scenario, the seeds they get damaged in the long run. So that is why last year, because of unseasonal rains, lack of uniform distribution of rainfall, failure of the monsoon system, saw a dip and an estimated fall in the onion production. Okay, you have to keep in mind the horticultural production overall in the country, and also there has been a dip in onion and potato. Other than that, tomato production is expected to increase, fruit production is expected to increase as well. Overall, if you take a look at it, then basically in the revised estimate of the past year, it was 355.48 million tons. This year it is 355.25. You never know what the revised estimate eventually comes out to be. In agricultural system, generally there is a lag of 2 to 3 years when you arrive at the accurate numbers. INS Kolkata assists vessels in Gulf of Aden, rescues 21 crew members by rescuing two different vessels in distress. So INS Kolkata is a naval destroyer, not a frigate. It is not a corvette. It is a destroyer. Destroyers are amongst the largest naval ships other than the aircraft carriers, obviously. So this destroyer has been deployed in the region of Gulf of Aden in order to ensure the free navigation and take care of the attacks being carried out by the Houthi rebels. Now, in the region of Gulf of Aden, that passes through a choke point where the vessels come very close to the coastline. Basically, if you take a look at the region of the Horn of Africa and the region of the Arabian Peninsula, this one side, let's suppose this is the Arabian Peninsula and this is Africa. Now, it is here where you have the Gulf of Aden. And basically, it is connected to the Red Sea by a narrow strait, a narrow passage, that is the Bab al Mandeb passage. Mandeb. Now, this Bab al Mandeb ensures that the ships have to navigate very close to the coastline. And this is where Yemen is situated, from where the Houthi rebels they fire off the missiles. Okay, that is where the Indian Navy has deployed INS Kolkata, and it has successfully carried out the rescue. Now, after 3 years, steel demand to grow in single digits in 2024-25. For the past few years, it has been growing in double digit, but it has reduced because of increasing supply from countries like China and Vietnam. Now, as a result of that, the global supply chains they are favoring the steel from these areas, from the other competing countries. But in India, what has also lowered the overall growth in the steel sector is basically reduced domestic demand. Why there has been a reduced domestic demand? That is because the capital expenditure which the government has carried out in the latest quarter, where it indicated a stupendous or a significant growth rate of around 8% plus. Now, in that, the capital expenditure has reduced. Capital expenditure, the one that you invest for infrastructure building, highways, rail construction, etc., that has been reduced slightly in order to keep the fiscal deficit in mind and in control. And the sector is arguing, and the experts are arguing basically, that anyways in the election year, the expenditure on capital is kept low in order to keep the overall deficit figures at a lower rate. So, because the capital expenditure is going to be low in the near term future of 6 months, that is why the steel supply and the demand in the domestic market is going to be low. But when it comes to the international market, resurgence of China and Vietnam in the sector is posing a risk, along with the downgrading of the economic setup in the developed nations has further reduced the demand in the international market, along with the supply chain shocks due to the various conflicts. That steel demand has further reduced. Now, then, Cabinet approves 10,370 crores for AI corpus, artificial intelligence. Now, this is a money, with the amount of money that the government is seeking to provide for the startups in the AI sector in order to have an increased avenue research carried out and new products being developed, utility of AI across other sectors of production as well. It is the largest direct investment by the government in the AI sector, and it will be carried out through the portion of India AI mission. So that is how the funds will be basically given out. And eventually, GPUs, graphic processor units, etc., will also be made. And the utility of AI with this investment is set to. Okay, so where is this being utilizable? About whether or what are the initiatives taken by the government to improve AI and blockchain. These sort of questions are asked. Okay, so you have India AI mission under which money is crafted. Then coming to the last article, government panel backs higher carbon tax on coal import. This is on the back of the fact that India, despite being one of the large producers of coal in the world, still ends up being the second largest or the biggest importer of coal from various different countries such as Indonesia, Australia, and so on. Now, why is it so? Despite the fact that we have just witnessed a tremendous record production in the previous year, still we import a lot of coal. That is because that the coal produced in India, most of them are of low grade, high ash content, high sulfur content, low calorific value, right? So the indigenous variety of coal has got low calorific value. Low calorific value means it will give lesser energy when you burn it. Then high ash content and sulfur content. Now, as a consequence of that, what will be the outcome? Basically, the industries would want coal of higher efficacy, and that is why they import the coal. In order to promote the domestic coal produced and utility of domestic coal and reduce the import bill, that is why on the lines of the various import taxes imposed by various different other countries of the world, the government panel has said that impose this carbon tax on any imported coal so that their price becomes higher and competitive with our own domestic coal. Only then will people have an option whether to use the domestic or the coal procured from international or imported markets. Okay. Now, coming on to the questions. Discuss the reasons attributed to low female labor force participation in India and suggest the measures to improve the scenario. This is for 15 marks or 250 words. Now, here in the introduction, you can always write about that how labor force participation indicates the well-being and the socio-economic conditions of society. India is plagued by a particularly reduced and reducing or decreasing labor force participation for the past couple of decades. While the surrounding nations like China have a labor force participation, female labor force participation of close to around 61%, India is staring at a female labor force participation of only close to around 30%. After that, talk about the fact that how various different IMF, World Bank reports, they have talked about increasing the GDP by increasing the labor force participation. How do you do that? Provide incentives for them, and the burden or for work should be shared by both men and women. Education, awareness, all of that should increase. Even when it comes to domestic chores, the domestic help, they should be provided with a living wage in the construction sector. So all the articles that we have discussed, you can basically bring the gist of it forward. Then discuss the measures required in order to prevent man-animal conflict. The introduction will simply be about how this man-animal conflict is reducing to or leading to a loss of biodiversity and what this conflict is about. Then talk about the long run and the short-term measures, invasive alien species, deploying drone surveillance, formation of monitoring committee, ensuring that there is no undergrowth in these areas, then smart fencing, all of that. Okay, so that is how you can write the answer. I advise you, encourage you to write as much of these answers as possible, and that is how you will improve eventually. So that is where we end the analysis, a bit prolonged analysis for the longer articles which had appeared in today's newspaper. If you have liked the video, if you have liked the content, please don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again tomorrow, take care of yourself. Goodbye.